Hi everyone, this is Mehul Mehta and welcome to my podcast. So for today's session, we have Dimitri Bianco. Dimitri doesn't need any any introduction. But Dimitri was on my podcast like almost like two times back then. And for today's session, he'll be walking us through how cons build different models in CCAR. So this whole video will be more focused on CCAR modeling. So Dimitri, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen real quick. Let's see. Okay, awesome. All right, so you guys, students, everyone who's on here, feel free to interrupt, ask questions. It'll add some depth to it as well. But I will go through this a little bit on my history and my background with CCAR and a little bit on CCAR in itself. So let me just go over my career with this. You guys can kind of see where I'm coming from and how I'm a little bit dated, perhaps. But CCAR, which we'll go through the history, really kicked off with the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. I came on the scenes in 2014 after I graduated from my applied economics and financial engineering kind of focused master's at Michigan. And my first job was to work at Comerica Bank doing model implementation for this newfangled thing called CCAR. We had no idea what was really going on, to be honest with you guys. I remember my first job going down and introducing me to a guy who was like one of the head of the finance departments. And so he had nothing to do with modeling, wasn't a quant or anything. And I sat down in his office and we shot the breeze for, I don't know, probably about an hour. And he was telling me like in 2010, the bank was being asked to do CCAR and they had to build like statistical models. And he's like, I'm a business person. So it goes into Excel and we put some things in and we draw some charts and do some averages and moving averages and stuff. And we submit it to regulators and they say, what are the p-values? Did you guys test for, heteroscedasticity in this model? And, he's didn't know what to say. He goes, I have no idea. So he goes, we realized after the first year, we need to bring in a bunch of quants. And so quant finance really started taking off, I think, after the 2007, 2008 financial crisis for the banks, for the sell side of this. Prior to that, a lot of it was on the investing or the sell side. Banks were using them as well for a lot of financial engineering products. But CCAR and Dodd-Frank was really the big kickoff, I think, for the quant industry and better practices in risk management. But after I did that in 2014 for about a year, I did model development and implementation. They were short on model developers. So I got my hands dirty on actually struggling with these sort of, modeling problems. And again, since there was no insight, there was no industry experts, we were basically all figuring this out as an industry together. I learned a lot over that experience. And then I left Comerica and went to BCG for a 3-month stint, specifically to consult one of the largest global banks on operational CCAR modeling. It was an oversight position for internal audit. And so I came in and helped them rewrite all their documentation. I have fond memories of staying up at like, I don't know, 2:30 in the morning in Long Island City, riding my colleagues home on the subway to make sure they got home, the girls at least. And anyways, being up there at like 1, 2 in the morning and like, frantically rewriting documentation and signing off and getting approvals. And like I'd go up to like the 33rd, 34th floor and it's just pitch black. And there's like one little light in the corner, cubicles on. And that's the person I've got to go find to help them, make some sort of model updates before the deadline. So it was fun. It was a good experience. And then I left there after my project and went to work for Santander. I did a combination of CCAR and auto finance and mortgage and some other products as well. But at Santander, I was there for so long, I started drifting over into the auto finance space. We had CCAR, which had to align with CECL, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. But you're essentially modeling similar things, but you have to use completely different frameworks and completely different mindsets to get it. So it's been a very odd process to do it. But I did it at Santander for a little bit. I helped push this over. Again, the firm I was working for in 2015, we helped them pass CCAR. And then at Santander, I was there when I helped, pass CCAR again, working in model validation. So my career has been, mainly CCAR, and then it kind of faded away. And I haven't done it as much in the last, I don't know, at least the last 5 years here. I currently work at a fintech firm, and so we do not do CCAR because we are not a bank. But I'll note here at the bottom as well, I wrote a paper back in 2016 called Uses and Abuses of ARIMA and PPNR Modeling in Risk Management. Why not to fear ARIMA? And I'll talk a little bit about why ARIMA, or more specifically, Cerimax modeling is king in the CCAR space, and yet it is feared by most banks. You'll even hear in interviews companies say, this is garbage, no one's using it. and magically it's the only methodology that works pretty well. So anyways, there's a paper on that if anyone's interested. The history of this is in 2007, U.S. housing prices crashed, as we all know, liquidity crisis due to mortgages. And then 2008, mortgage-backed securities led to the collapse of Bear Stearns. And then again in 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, and the Treasury Department had to bail them out with taxpayer dollars for $700 billion. What you probably don't see online, at least I didn't see when I was researching this, but I know many of the banks were actually required to put in funds themselves. So even though your bank was not failing and you had better risk practices, many banks in the system were having to kind of prop up and support the entire rest of the industry here. So when you start thinking about this presentation from a risk perspective, even if you are the best bank out there, if the banking system's going down, often regulators are going to require you to prop up other firms. We can see that too with Silicon Valley Bank. I think that got purchased out, or one of the banks that failed recently got bought up by another bank, like JP Morgan or someone stepped in. Often the regulators kind of cut a deal, but you're going to be required to kind of front some of that bill. And then in 2010, Obama signs in Dodd-Frank Act. I'm not a huge fan of regulation, but I think oddly enough, this is probably one of the best regulations I've seen. At least the intentions are good. The modeling was good. The regulation, the implementation hasn't been so great, especially in recent years here, which we'll see in a second. But in 2011, the CFPB was formed as well. So it's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This is just another layer of regulation, which I won't go into my opinions on that, but CFPB is there as well to kind of regulate. And then 2015, the Volcker rule stops prop trading at banks. And then in 2018, President Trump signed in reduction to Dodd-Frank, which I think is called like the rollback. And that moved all these thresholds. So I can tell you from when I started in 2014, or at least shortly after, maybe 2016-ish, banks were spending a ton of money lobbying to remove Dodd-Frank or to diminish it to a much, much smaller regulation. In 2018, it moved it from $50 billion. So any bank that had $50 billion in assets was required to do CCAR. And then in 2018, it got moved to 250. And then there's some fuzzy stuff in the middle, which we'll talk about, like HCR, which is horizontal capital review. Essentially, they took CCAR and it was really complicated and cost a bunch of money, and they created a stripped down version for smaller banks. And then a lot of the other banks that were, I think, less than 10 billion in assets have basically been removed. So they're not even having to do any of these sort of regulations and tests and modeling. I'll note here too, you'll see a lot of what's called GSIB. There's a lot of emphasis on discussing this, which is globally systematically important banks. You can imagine them, right? Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, typically some of those banks. They have a lot of assets. They're globally kind of situated, and they have these strictest regulations. And then as you kind of go down these different tiers of assets on books and complexity, which has with derivatives and different, counterparties, you'll see here that that's going to change on the regulations here. So it was huge. CCAR was this huge hiring position for quants. A lot of quants started their careers here. And then a lot of us have kind of moved into other areas as CCAR's kind of gotten cut back as of 2018. So what is the purpose of CCAR, right? What's actually going on here? So the entire premise of CCAR, which I think makes a lot of sense, is you have a bunch of banks and they failed because of liquidity reasons, right? That was 2007, 2008, mortgages crashed. We looked at Silicon Valley Bank. Again, it crashed because liquidity issues. And you keep looking at bank failure after bank failure after bank failure, and it's always, or at least mainly, it's caused by liquidity. There's some sort of liquidity issue. In the long run, like even like LTCM, it's a long-term capital management, which is a famous hedge fund ran by, I think, Merton, Scholes, but definitely not Fisher Black. He was too risk adverse. They were involved in this company. And again, there was a shift in markets with Russia, and it went under. But again, in the long run, if they can hold these positions long enough, often firms can make it, but liquidity is always the thing that kind of kills a lot of these firms. So the whole premise of this is that, let's take each and every bank, let's provide some sort of stress scenario on here, and then we're going to forecast out 9 quarters from today. And you're going to be given 3 scenarios, which I'll be showing here in a second. It's going to be called base, adverse, and severely adverse. So base is like what you think is going to happen over the next 9 quarters, business as usual. Adverse is going to be like we hit a little bit of a bumpy road, but nothing too crazy. And then severely adverse should be almost the same magnitude as the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. And the banks are going to have to do their stressing of their bank which is just accounting. So you're going to look at the income statement, you're going to look at the balance sheet, and literally everything that's on those statements there, those accounting documents, has to be stressed in some way. So income statement is going to be income and expenses. So I'll talk about some examples here in a second. Balance sheet is going to be assets and liabilities. And so we're going to look at, if we stress all of these components and we go through another, made up scenario by the federal regulators, what is going to happen to the cash, and is the bank going to be okay? So this is kind of what we're going to be doing here. CCAR and HCR, again, are going to be, determined based on size. And it's really going to be seeing if we have enough liquidity and capital to survive these sort of stress scenarios here. I will note too that if you fail it, so it's a huge deal. Like people think it's like, oh, it's a regulation. We just like build garbage models. I know a lot of departments think that's what we do. They don't realize that if the models aren't built correctly and if your policies and procedures aren't done properly, you will result in fines. And I believe there have been fines that have been issued for failures in CCAR. I have personally seen either employees removed, or the regulators will actually write a letter to the bank saying these individuals and employees you have are not qualified. They should be removed from your teams. I don't know, Mehul, if you've been on these, but every time we'd go through the big annual stress test, this like email would go out and be like, hey, can everyone send us your updated resume? And I'm always like, why are we sending resumes? This makes no sense. Have you had that?
No, we didn't had that because like the bank was able to pass through the stress testing, so we didn't had that. To be honest, yeah.
Okay, that might have been an early days thing.
Right.
Even more recently, I've had one. But yeah, so a lot of times they'll ask for resumes. So like the regulators are even looking at your resumes to see which school did you go to, how long have you worked, what areas have you worked in. So they're really assessing a lot of this to try to get a full picture on how valid it is. And I don't believe any bank has technically failed because the models were quote unquote bad. But they will fail you because you have bad governance, which is you don't have the right processes and procedures. Like, are you actually managing the risk? Validation. So you have model development and the validation goes and reviews all those results. Do you have good validation practices, right? I mean, how do you make sure that you're having a check and a balance here? So these sorts of things are critical. I've set through, many on-site reviews as well. So the regulators, you'll have a list, like a piece of paper, and it will have like, I don't know, like 100 models or 200 models, whatever you have. And the regulators will come through with like a pen and they mark the ones they want. And they send you out an email and say, hey, we're going to be there in a week or 2 weeks, whatever it is. You have a very short period. We're going to interview you on these specific models. We will see you in 2 weeks. And then like everybody drops everything and scrambles to get documentation and data and paperwork. And I've sat in these meetings before and they will go through like nuanced math and stats. Like, why did you guys use this model? It failed this test. You had this in your validation report that it failed. Why is the model still being used? And then the regulators will split model development and model validation into 2 different meetings. So you can't see each other. You can't talk. There's no sort of communication within the firm. So there's kind of this, this real deep interrogation of making sure this was done correctly, which is critical here. So the whole goal here is we're going to stress this and we're going to make sure it's done right. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we're going to use for this. So career-wise, working in CCAR was amazing because all of your data is clean. It is very, very clean. I had no idea what they were talking about. Practitioners complaining about dirty data. This was just like academia. Data came in. All the data from the bank was already aggregated from other departments, and you were given some sort of, asset or expense or liability you needed to model. And it was whatever it was, what it was. It was one time series. And then you'd get data from a vendor, typically Moody's. And that data, again, was like this kind of table here you're going to see. It's going to have a bunch of macroeconomic variables, real GDP, nominal GDP, disposable income, unemployment, CPI, all those. And you're going to have actual data, and you can get it either quarterly or monthly, typically from the vendors. And then you're going to have essentially 9 quarters, which they're also going to provide here. So this red area on the bottom is going to be the 9 quarters, but that's going to be a forecast. It's not real data. That's just what the vendor is going to give you. Typically, the vendors have a bunch of different kind of scenarios. So they're going to be focused on specific types of events and specific types of issues. So maybe you're not exposed to the investing side of it. Maybe you're only on the loan side. You can get specific scenarios and data that's stressed more for those scenarios for you. so you can build the data, and you use all this to build the data. And then when you go to do the stress test, guess what? That data you had, you don't get it anymore. The Fed gives you new data with their own scenarios, and your model now has to work on this new data it's never seen. And then it's going to predict out, again, assets, liabilities, income, and expenses. It's going to tell you how much essentially liquidity you have in these scenarios, these stress scenarios. And if you do not have enough, they can essentially tell you you need to sell assets or you need to liquidate positions to meet these sort of thresholds here. So on a bank, right, you don't want to be told you can't use your money to go make more money, right? We take money and we lend it out and whatnot. So banks are very, very cautious of the forecasts that come out of these. They spend a lot of time looking at the forecasting scenario and making sure the numbers aren't too crazy high, because you might be holding way too much capital on the books and be too safe. And then as a firm, you're going to be making less loans and holding a bunch of reserves here. Something else to kind of know about this is that you cannot do your forecasting internally. So I was at one of the banks and they had an economist who used to work for Moody's and was fairly high up in their economic forecasting division. And the firm was trying to get their data, like to use them to create our own forecasts. And the regulator said, absolutely not. You need to purchase data from these vendors. It's a conflict of interest. So you'll see here as we get going through this, right? It's the data piece is challenging. It's very clean, but trying to get these forecasts can be a tough decision and kind of a tough modeling piece. Common issues with the modeling. The models are required to be conceptually sound. So inside the banking and the quant space, this is common sense. If you look outside in tech, this is a much more challenging, I guess, proposition. Everything has to be statistically significant. So p-values need to be significant. Stationarity needs to pass. Residuals need to be white noise. And you have to explain the exact relationship which is going through the model. Like you can't just find high correlations, run the model, and then send them to regulators, because remember, they're reading the development document, which has to explain this. Then they're reading the critique from the validation team to see if the validation team is going to be challenging the development team. So you have to be very cognizant of these sorts of conceptually sound practices, the explainability piece here. It is very, very rigorous and it is very academic, I think, and focused compared to many other areas of the quant space. All models should have 2 macroeconomic variables or more. Sometimes you get away with having 1, but you don't know what the Fed's going to give you for a scenario. So you want to make sure that you're not too sensitive to 1 variable, and the Fed decides to make this case really high. And now, since your model is only using 1 variable, you might have sky high forecasts. So trying to get the sensitivity dialed in and having more economic variables can be challenging. You'll see here as we get going through this, often when you do, again, the conceptually sound piece of this, you're going to have to try to put other variables in. And as you put them in, then the one that was significant gets pushed out. And so then you're like scratching your head and you're like, okay, let me rechange the whole model structure, the lag system. You're like searching. A lot of teams I worked with were spending about a month to about 6 weeks just looking at the right variables to go in. And everybody's like pushing things in and things are coming out. And then the residuals aren't white noise anymore. And it's this weird game of like, I don't know, like you're trying to fix it and nothing will fit inside. Everything's kind of blowing up. So this is actually much more challenging than people assume. You'll see here in a second, we'll talk a little bit about that. And then seasonality and granularity specification is something that can be a little bit challenging as well. So as you're kind of struggling with this model and you can't get it to fit, sometimes you're going to just switch granularity. So monthly is more granular. Sometimes it's easier to do a prediction, but sometimes it's too volatile. So sometimes you'll switch back over to quarter over quarter or just quarterly data. And as you're doing quarterly data, now you're going to have less data points. So there are some pros and cons from switching the seasonality and the granularity specifications of the model. It's going to be a challenge, but it's something you have to look at. Often we try to do monthly just because having more data points makes the fitting and the specification easier. If you have 1 quarter that's out, sometimes the statistical tests will come back, saying the model sucks. But if you move it to monthly, sometimes it looks good. So kind of playing with those is another issue we commonly face. Outliers are often not outliers. So this is critical. I'll make this statement. Most firms I've been at will fit a model and they'll say it does not fit. It is not statistically sound. I cannot meet any of these requirements, Dimitri. And we have our data. And if we remove these 2 outlier data points, the model fits great and everything's significant. And then I always ask them, okay, right, this is small data sets. This is monthly time series. 10 years is only 120 data points. So we're not working with a lot here. Even if you have 20 years, you're only at 240. what are these outliers? And they go, well, we strategically decided to change the focus of the firm. And so we made this shift. And so we had to realign and everything spiked. I'm like, okay. And how many times have we changed strategy in the last 10 years? They go, well, probably about 10 times. And so you're like scratching your head, like, all right, well, it's not really an outlier. It's just you guys made a decision to change something, and that's going to happen in the future. And so you can't really just remove outliers when you don't have much data. Mehul, do you have any comments on that? Have you done work with that?
Yes, I have definitely saw that because during I guess during the pandemic, the banks, if you see the accounts, there was a lot of influx of money. So we use actually a dummy variable to account for that because we could not use any other thing, to account for the inflow of money. But we knew the reason was okay, Fed is dispersing the money. So definitely we did use some dummy variables to account for those outliers.
Yeah, and it's very hard because you're right. You say it's a dummy, and then you have to have the story, right? You have to explain exactly what happened and why it happened and how it's most likely not going to happen again. You have to make that conceptually sound argument.
Right. Also, Dimitri, just a quick question which I wanted to ask on the stationarity. So when when we build more quant models, let's say any time series models, we do check for stationarity. So one of the common tests that we use is augmented Dickey-Fuller test, and
Mhm.
there's one more test which is the KPSS test. So so like during your time, like when you were building the model, were you using just one stationarity test, or were you using bunch of them and then finalizing it?
No, we were only using ADF,
Okay.
augmented Dickey-Fuller. Um, the KPSS test, the other one is quite similar. You should have similar results. Um, but Dickey-Fuller we found to be just a little bit more, believe it was more robust, just
Right.
in outliers and distributions. Yeah, I'll cover to a little bit later on the testing of it because this is actually the hardest part, and it is the part I think almost every bank has not solved, which like makes me laugh because I've never had a model for CCAR I couldn't build. So we'll go through that, but yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So outliers are critical. And then finally, one of the big don'ts here, which I don't know if you've seen, but don't use growth rates of rates. This drives me insane. I've seen it almost every bank I've been at, and as a model validator, I've filled every model that has this. And management understands it like instantly. Like the finance side, they get it. If you have like a growth rate, like the GDP growth rate, and then you take a difference or the rate of that rate, it's really hard to conceptually explain what is the rate of the growth rate and why does it impact the model. Also, that makes the volatility of the forecasts really, really crazy. So if the Fed gives you anything that's like over 10% more or less than what was in your development data, often the data, when you have like autoregressive terms, it just like spikes to crazy high numbers. So you will get dinged in the regulatory review for it. You will get dinged, hopefully, by the finance department if they look at it. But every department I've seen is like, oh, it's the only thing that's statistically significant. And no, you cannot use them. It drives me insane. But yeah, that's another challenge that you'll see or kind of run into.
So even is that true for the target variable that we are trying to model, or is it just for the economic variables?
I'd argue both. Is your
Okay.
target? Yeah, because your target variable is typically like an account. Uh, so as an example, I don't know what you modeled, but I modeled like one of the accounts was called ORE. It was owned real estate. So this was really interesting because this was after 2007, 2008 when the financial crisis crashed because of mortgages.
Right.
The bank was stuck with a bunch of mortgages on books. So all these customers defaulted and walked away. And the bank is stuck with this massive portfolio of mortgages. While the bank is required to mow the lawn, make sure the houses are like not leaking, they don't have damage. So the bank's having to go in and actually has all these expenses accruing to go in and keep up these properties, and the expenses are like running, and the bank can't offload these houses, right? Because nobody wants a house post 2007, 2008 because no one has any money to afford one. And then you just defaulted on a loan, so no one's going to give you another loan. So we focused on modeling those quite a bit. But again, I don't know if any of the target variables themselves would be differenced. I can. Are you thinking differencing for the stationarity piece?
Yeah, that's what, because one of the model that we were building did had growth in it. So that's why like I was curious why. And like when we did perform stress testing, scenario analysis, it was performing good. So on the target variable, we did basically use first order differencing to make to make it stationary, and then we use that. So
Did you guys have an intercept in the model?
yes, we did had intercept.
The model's wrong.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I'll show you in a second. um, so model issues, this is kind of an example. This is what you guys will actually see, right? Your green data is going to be your actuals. In this case, the colors here drive me nuts. I don't know if you guys had a standard colored standards. We had blue as the actuals or black. I think black was the actuals, blue was base, orange was adverse, and red was severely adverse, and every document had to match. Did you guys have any of that?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, definitely. We had color combinations for base adverse, severe adverse. Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, this one drives me nuts. I pulled this from I think economy.com. It was one of the actual outputs from KeyBank, but it drives me nuts because blue you assume is like safe and like cool colored, but it's the adverse scenario, and then base seems the worst. But anyways, um, your forecasts also should not cross, or at least have minimal cross, and they should rank order. So in this case, this is going to be non-transaction accounts, market share. Base is going to be on the bottom. Then when the market gets worse, it's going to go up, and then severely adverse is going to go even up, further up. When you have like assets, for example, they should go the opposite. So base should be at the top, and then adverse should go down, and then severely adverse should go the worst. So you always want to look at the ranking of that because that makes a difference, kind of interpreting that. But this kind of your standard, what you'll see as CCAR. This is what kind of your forecasting and what you're kind of doing here. So let's go through the modeling overview here. Data is often cleaned, as I mentioned. It's always cleaned. It's amazing. It's easy. You will split your data based on time. I hate saying this, but I see so many people, especially in the machine learning space, not doing this. In finance, you have to split it based on calendar time. So if we're modeling, we're going to forecast from 24 onward. You'd have development through like 23, and then you'd use like 24 as like your out of time, and then you would have your forecasting period after that. You cannot mix them and randomly sample. Economic scenarios are just, they're time oriented. You have to have them in time. Variable transformations. So as we're kind of talking about, right, you'll start to see that you can't find a variable easily, or maybe you're trying to get stationarity within the variables. And so you start doing like month over month differences, or you're doing growth rates, which is going to be the difference divided by the original one, in quarters and yearly. And you're going to take logs, for example, you're trying to get some sort of transformation. Often banks will do all these transformations up front. You have a massive table, and then you work on the model fitting process. And so then you get into model selection here. Now, typically, I'm going to just tell you that almost every model I've ever seen is in Cerimax, which is seasonally autoregressive, integrated moving average with exogenous variables. This covers anything in the ARIMA, ARIMAX, ARX, like any sort of combination of that. We just generally throw it out there. It's the easiest to use. It is the easiest to explain economically. So you can come up with that conceptual soundness, and you write like this beautiful story on GDP and unemployment's causing, I don't know, our asset or our checking accounts to go up or whatnot. It works really well. You could use OLS if you do not have serial correlation. You almost always have serial correlation in every single account I've ever seen in time series. LSTM is often too complicated, so a lot of newbies think it's like really fun to jump in the ML space, and that's fine, but it's really, really hard to explain. And then when regulators start tearing you apart in an exam, it's not so fun. So I would just recommend you typically start with Cerimax, and then in rare scenarios, you might need to go to GARCH if you just can't, get the heteroscedasticity out of the residual. But that's kind of the most common framework.
Just
Yeah.
just a quick question, Dimitri. So Cerimax, is it used with a combination of macroeconomic variables, or Cerimax is used just standalone?
The X part of it is going to be the exogenous factor.
Okay.
So we consider anything macroeconomically exogenous on that. Yeah. I was really confused when I started my job because everyone was telling us we're using ARIMA. And then I went to a conference or something. I was talking to somebody about it, and they're like, you can't use ARIMA. And they're like lecturing me, and I'm so confused. And then I realized later it's because, yeah, the X just represents the exogenous factor. But it took me, I think, like 6 months to figure that one out. So, and then finally, after you fit this whole model and you think it's great and wonderful, you have to do all this model testing for assumptions and performance. And then annoyingly, the business will do overrides. So you will spend 3 months or something building this model, and it's like you fine tune it to perfection. You're so happy it's done, and validation signs off and you're completed. And then the business goes, well, these numbers seem too high. We're going to do a 10% overlay to reduce it or whatever. And you're like, what's the point? So yeah, that's kind of a demoralizing piece, but it happens a lot. I think every firm I've been at has done overlays. So let's just run through a quick example here with you guys, just to kind of get more of like the modeling feel here, right? So we're talking about the generals, but let's kind of get into this. Um, First off is going to be the hardest piece of this, which is stationarity. I have spent an entire career arguing this. I was trained by a girl who had a PhD from Claremont in economics, probably the brightest person I've ever met in time series. She spoke in such a way that most people didn't understand what she was saying. But I was the person that instead of being irritated with her and ignoring her, I decided to have lunchtime lessons with her instead, where she went to lecture me about how financial engineers are stupid people and how economists and mathematicians are smart people. But putting your pride aside was beneficial. I learned a ton from her, and that's kind of stuck with me because we were like mathematically proving why everybody at the firm was wrong and why she didn't like everybody. But it made my career in many ways. The ADF test is one of these, and I think many people just don't go read the original paper by Dickey and Fuller, and I think that would benefit many of them. But when you have data in, especially in SAS, which I don't know what you guys are working, Mehul, are you guys working in SAS or are you working in Python?
So we used to build models in Python, but when we used to submit it to model validation, we used to give it in SAS. So yeah.
Okay, I've always used SAS. I hated SAS when I started. I have a soft spot now for SAS. I really like it for doing this sort of work. Actually, David Dickey worked with SAS to build all the time series packages. And so they have all these really cool features and like nuanced detail on how they're actually working that is far better than any free open source thing I've ever seen. So this is great. So all this output you guys are seeing on here is going to be SAS. But the top left chart here with these four charts is going to be your actual data. And so what you're looking for is when you run your ADF test, your augmented Dickey-Fuller stationarity test, is you're going to actually have three different scenarios. You're going to have zero mean, single mean, and you're going to have trend. You need to understand which test to use because you can't just look at them and say it passes one of the tests and therefore it's correct. You're going to look at this chart of your actual data and see, does it look trended? Like, does it look like it has like some serial correlation? It's kind of moving around over time. Doesn't have to be like linearly correlated or anything. It just needs to be kind of, having runs. If that's the case, you're going to be using the trend test from the Dickey-Fuller. So again, I have raw here. It's the raw data. If it seems to be kind of bouncing around some sort of value that is not zero. So I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Maybe interest rates, for example. They might be stuck around one rate for a very long time when you're modeling. You might look at like a single mean test because it seems to be within a specific range. And then finally, when you difference it, which we talked about, right? One of the ways to make data that's not stationary. So we're looking at the data, it's not stationary, it doesn't work. You're going to take the first difference. You're going to take today minus yesterday, and you're going to run that difference through the augmented Dickey-Fuller test. And in SAS, it's going to show you this little one in parentheses right next to your Y variable, indicating it has been differenced once. And then you will only use the zero mean test because now when you difference any data, the difference will have a mean of zero or close to zero. So you always use zero mean, and you will look at the actual results that come out of the ADF. The other piece that commonly is missed is that if the row value they give you is going to be less than one, you use the p-value for the row test. And you want it to be less than 0.05 to indicate that it is stationary. If the value is going to be greater than one, then you're going to use the tau test and you will use the residuals for the tau test. Now, this is critical for the industry because I have seen so many model developers submit models and write a whole documentation list on how the model is not stationary and they understand that. And then they provide all these tables and they misread the tables, but the model actually works and is stable just because they misread this sort of table here. Anyways, you're going to run this test. You're going to look for this. The ACF, PACF, and IACF charts should all be within the blue ranges. You can tell by looking at the p-values. Again, for the zero mean, they're not less than 0.05, so this is not stationary. And then also when you look at these ACF, PACF, and IACF charts, they're outside of those blue ranges. Those blue ranges are going to be looking at the lags here. In this example, I'm only showing lag 0 and 1. For CCAR, you should be doing 1 year. So if it's quarterly, just look out to 4. 4 quarters. If it's monthly data, you need to look out to 12, and it should be stationary at all lags within that kind of structure here. This is the hardest part. We have required, and I have required as validator, that all macroeconomic variables in the model are going to be stationary. And by definition, mathematically, if those are all stationary, then your dependent variable also needs to be stationary. And if that occurs every single time when you build the model and it's done correctly and they're significant, your residual will be white noise. So you really don't even need to test that. But you can run the test and look at that, and that will happen, and it will look beautiful, and you will pass your model development stage for that. So this is hard. If you do first differencing and that doesn't work, you can do second differencing. And if that doesn't work, most people give up. You need to do seasonal differencing. One of the interesting things I've noticed, you can kind of actually see in this data a little bit. If you look at the really low peaks, like at probably 17 and like 25, often there's like a pattern like in your data that might happen every quarter, every year. I can tell you, like in the auto space with defaults, every year defaults plummet and everyone does amazing right around tax season. And that is because during tax season, everybody's getting a refund. And so we're all able to make our auto loan payments. Some of that data when we've modeled for CCAR is not stationary. And it fails the first difference, the second difference. If you do a 12-month difference, magically it's stationary. Because there's an annual cycle to the economy and to income, like Christmas time, for example, impacts auto loans, for example. People have less cash during the holidays. They're buying presents and everything. So the 12-month lags actually line up year over year, and everything works out great. So again, if you do like a 12-month difference here, so instead of doing, today minus yesterday, minus the day before, minus the day before, you just do today minus 12 months ago. And that, oddly enough, makes it stationary. Sometimes quarterly does that as well. But that is kind of a trick I have seen many people not use in the industry, but it works great. And then you can pass all your tests and regulators will be happy with you. The other issue we run into a lot is shifts and lags. So this was something that plagued us for a while until we figured it out. SAS outputs a cross correlation analysis here. So this is just kind of made up data with the S&P 500. And it's looking at the triple B interest rate here. But what it's going to show you is it's going to show you the cross correlation essentially across time with your dependent variable that you're modeling and all your macroeconomic variables. Sometimes the correlation is very good and it will make it into the model and be significant. However, the timing of them is like a lead and a lag. So like maybe GDP goes up and it takes like 1, 2, or 3 months before that is impacted into whatever account you're modeling. If you try to regress the two on themselves, you're not going to find statistical significance because they never align. That relationship never fully exists, and the model can't see that that's there. If you align your variables, and of course you can only lag them backwards in time, sometimes you'll find high correlations going forward in time because the relationship's opposite. But you can't do that because we can't see the future. Aligning these up is really important. You can actually get save yourself a lot of headache and find models quicker by doing this. Again, SAS does this, which makes it really easy. But that's something else to kind of think about. Again, there's also business logic in here. So when you're writing documentation and everything, you can explain to the regulators this story and why it all works. And then finally, you're going to go through kind of fitting your model. So should you use just an AR model? Should you use just an MA model? Should you be using a whole ARIMA model? I mean, what should you be kind of doing with this? I'll let you know too that AR and MA terms tend to cancel each other out. So if you add in an AR1 and that doesn't work, and then you add in an MA1, they essentially the effects kind of negate each other, and the model will never be fairly super stable. So it'll kind of bounce around. And it's really frustrating because, and I'm sure you've tried, it's like you get the variables, you put them in, you think everything's going to work. Then you add you're going to use your ACF chart. I believe this is for the MAs, the moving average component. That's how you read this. And then the partial autocorrelation function is for reading for the autoregression components. You can add them in slowly and start with low numbers like 1, 2, or 3, and then look to see where you have bars sticking out. So like in the ACF chart, you have one probably around like lag 13. You might add these in and take these out trying to get to that stable model component here. It can be a little bit frustrating. And then finally, when you fit this model and you're looking for this, This is all from the residuals. The bottom right chart is the white noise test. All these bars are less than the 0.0 or greater than the 0.05. Chart looks a little backwards, but it's actually greater than 0.05. So you're good to go. It passes the model. There's no issue. There's no white noise essentially in this model, which is indicating stationarity and I think serial correlation within the residuals themselves here. The other piece too, I'll note, again, going back to the seasonal component of why we use Remax instead of just a Remax is, again, when you go into a model and you use like an AR3, the way most software fits it is it's going to use your Y variable lagged once, twice, and 3 times. You'll find magically that, of course, because you used your PACF chart and the third bar was out of the blue range, you added the AR3, that variable in the model now is going to be significant or statistically significant, so less than 0.05, but the lags 1 and 2 are not. And it blows your model up and it makes no sense. It's because you need a seasonally adjusted variable. So essentially, instead of using lags 1, 2, and 3 in that AR term, all you should be using is your dependent variable lagged 3 terms only. And that's going to be a seasonal adjustment essentially. And often you can get models to fit a lot better for doing that. I don't know why banks struggle with that. My first job, I was brought into a room and they were wanting me to explain to them as a student, like, Dimitri, what do you think this is? Like, what do you think the issue with this is? We build all these models and none of them last. And I don't know about your experience, but most firms I've been at, you built it, we ran it for DFAS, which was like the 6-year mid-year test, and you run it for CCAR, which is the end of the year. The models would never last. It's like you would build it, it'd last like 6 months maybe, and then at the year mark it would fail again, and then we'd have to like refit the whole thing over again. And that just leads me to think like maybe you just have bad model developers and you should just use machine learning and just like, auto refit every year, because it's kind of what we're doing. But I was really proud. I had the account that no one could model. I think it was the ORE account I talked about earlier. And because I was model implementation, not model development, they just threw it to me and said, well, this isn't an important count. Development team can't figure it out. Good luck. And I built it and it passed and we passed validation. And after I left, it was only there a year. I followed up with a buddy of mine, and 2 years later, it was still performing. They didn't have to refit anything. They just used this exact same model 2 years in a row. I don't know how long it eventually failed at some point, but I don't know how long it lasted. But I think using a lot of these tips and tricks in here, which oddly enough, I never really saw at the banks, these sort of things make development faster, quicker, and easier and less stressful. And then they, produce models that kind of last in the long run. And then finally, right, you have to do a forecast review. So as we talked about earlier, like this is like your forecast, it comes out, your model is significant, you spent months getting this thing built out. And then finally, it's going to have your base, adverse, and severely adverse cases. And the business is going to scrutinize this with a fine-tooth comb. They have no idea what the model is or what's in the model. They don't really care. They just want these numbers to look reasonable on their end and to make sure the bank doesn't have to hold a bunch of extra capital. Something else I'll note for you guys as well, when you do CCAR capital assessment, not all of your assets are worth $1 for dollar. So if you have like $100,000 in deposits, that is not the same value as $100,000 in equity or like investment positions. They will discount everything that is not cash. So checking accounts, CDs, things that are cash-like that can be liquidated easily, I think are like 100%. So whatever you have is considered 100% capital. And then things like you might have like a mortgages on your books that you can't close quickly, other sorts of positions like derivative products, perhaps, you're going to take a big haircut. So it might be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% haircut. So essentially, it's much more advantageous to hold deposits from customers because it's pure cash. But of course, you're not making much money on that. Then you are going to be holding kind of riskier assets. So that's kind of it, guys. That is my presentation in a nutshell. I kind of mentioned HCR in there. So CCAR is the full blown, you have to do every modeling, all the scrutiny to make it perfect. With that new regulation, HCR has been scaled way down. I haven't been involved too much in the HCR process, so I can't speak too much on it. But it has reduced it, and firms have gotten rid of a lot of their CCAR modelers. But it should be quite similar and have similar kind of theories and approaches with it.
Right. So thank you so much, Dimitri, for walking us through the whole model life cycle. I have a few questions which I really wanted to ask. So you mentioned about choosing economic variables. So you mentioned about choosing 2 or more economic variable, right? So like,
Yeah.
how do we go about choosing the right variable? So like, I used to use the Pearson correlation test. which is just to understand how much correlated these the independent variables are with the dependent variables. And then I we used to check the cross correlation, basically correlation of the target variable with the lags of the independent variable. So like in your modeling practice, like what you used to use?
So we do a similar approach. One of the big secrets I did, which didn't follow suit with everybody else, was they would assign me a model and then I'd go meet with the business and I'd hand them like the list. I'd print out the macroeconomic variables. I'd hand them a list and say, can you circle which variables you think are the most relevant? We'd give them no correlations or anything, just here's a variable list. And they'd mark them all off. And then I'd meet with them and try to understand what they're modeling. We were doing I think it was like an interest rates model for mortgages. And the most correlated variable in there was like, I think like the 3-month rate.
Hmm.
And then I went and talked to the business and they'd circled the 30-year rate.
Okay.
So, we did the same thing you did, right? We are going through correlations and cross correlations and trying to figure out the relationships. I ended up putting in, I think, the 30-year rate, not the 1 month or the 3 month. There's a bunch of short-term rates that were more correlated. And I found out the reasoning was a lot of the contracts, I think it was the 10-year rate we used. A lot of the contracts that the business had, they were exposed to corporate like mortgages, basically for like big office buildings and office supplies and warehouses. And typically those contracts are 10-year contracts. So it makes sense the 10-year rate would be the best variable to use,
Right.
but it's not the most significant. And it made the modeling, I think, slightly harder to start with. But as I met with the businesses at the beginning, it makes your variable selection process quicker and easier. Because then all of a sudden you'd have other variables that would come in with that, right? You'd have like a 3-month rate, and then like unemployment would be really significant. And then you're like scratching your head, like, I guess unemployment makes sense, right? For corporations, if there's not enough employees in the building and they're unemployed and they can't fill them, they're probably going to close these leases. Um, but when you're kind of doing that, the business piece was critical for us. The other piece, which I don't know if you've ever done, I did this before I knew what XG boost, or I think it's, yeah, X boosting was. We would run, or I would run the REMA model, and then I would take the residuals that were garbage, they were not white noise or anything, and I'd run the correlation between those residuals and all the other variables, and then figure out which variable was essentially like a missing variable bias. And then we would plug those ones into the model, and that would also help kind of in that process.
Mhm. Okay, okay, understood. So also like let's say if you found a variable which is like really highly correlated, but you are not able to find the business intuition behind it. So do you take that variable or do you drop that variable?
We would drop it. I know
Okay.
it's hard. It's hard. It's really hard from model development standpoint, right? Because you're like, this one thing makes the whole model great. Um, the weird thing I'll tell you is businesses can argue almost any variable and they can argue almost any relationship. Like I've had a model where they've argued for a positive correlation and then we redeveloped the model and then it turned out to be negative. And then they could argue the negative case.
Right.
But typically if the business says no, there's like no reasoning for it, then we'll just drop them.
Right. Also like, sorry, I'm asking bunch of questions, but yeah. So also like, let's say, sometimes the model validator says, you need to redevelop the model. So that is mostly when like when they see the difference between the actuals. I mean, when they see the actuals and the predicted to be way off. So
Mhm.
we used to have something like, traffic light approach in which we used to have if let's say the deviation is less than 1%, so it's in green zone. So and if let's say the deviation is between 1 to 5, or let's say 1 to 5%, it's in orange zone, and greater than 5, then it's in red zone. So red zone basically means you either need to recalibrate the model or redevelop the model. So like how did it, like how would you say on that, like how you used to do, like did it ever happen to you, like or was there any benchmark on when to redevelop or recalibrate the model?
The main test we used is we would recheck the p-values.
Mhm.
So we would, to your point, right? You look at the deviations, which is one approach. The other approach is we would take the exact same model, we would update it with like the 1 year of data, and we'd refit the model with the exact same variables. And if the p-values were wrong, and almost every time they were horribly wrong, then we would have to do a full model redevelopment.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. And then going back to the differencing, differencing the dependent variable with an intercept.
Yeah.
If you think about this using algebra, so imagine you have a difference. So say you have y of t minus y of t minus 1, which is what you're the modeling, and that's equal to your equation.
Mhm.
If you take your y of t minus 1 and you move it to the other side using algebra, now you have the raw variable is equal to your negative lag, actually your positive lag because you move it
Yeah.
over, your
Yeah.
lag. So that essentially is your intercept term. It's a dynamic intercept. When you have an intercept and you have that, essentially it's like you're shifting the whole model to make the adjustment. But often when you go back to do like a stress test, like
Right.
12 months later, the model will be wrong just because now all of a sudden that intercept is changing because it's a dynamic process within itself. So like conceptually, it makes no sense to have the intercept term and the differencing. And this is probably goes even deeper. I've read some books. I won't reference the authors, but um, this is also why like you don't lose any meaning or value when you do a difference. So I don't know if you've heard that. Like people say don't difference the data if possible, or do like a fractional difference. And the reason is because now you're losing the meaning, which I agree with, right? You have a growth rate. Like now, say you had dollar values, and now all of a sudden you're doing a difference. So now it's a difference in dollars, but now it's like bouncing around zero. That could mean anything. But
Right.
the argument is if you just restructure that equation and you move the different side to the other side, right? It's just a dynamic intercept. So you're actually losing no information because you have the intercept on the other side, which is setting the original level. And then the difference piece is just moving you up or down from where you originally are.
But don't you think like let's say when we shift it to the right hand side, it becomes AR1 with the
It
other,
does. It
yeah,
does.
yeah,
That is
with
why
the,
you do the difference though, because it's a unit root.
right,
It's a perfect unit root. The correlation between that variable in itself is perfectly one or
right.
close to one. We can argue it's exactly one, but you're essentially saying that the AR term is exactly one. And because it is exactly one is the reason it's failing the augmented Dickey-Fuller test. So by subtracting it from itself, you're actually now reducing the AR1 process in itself. So you're kind of saying, I agree this variable is non-stationary. And so we're going to actually put the variable in the model itself to explain that amount of information. And then you check the ADF again.
Understood. Okay, understood. Got your point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I've gone around in these meetings so much. I've had to do math on pieces of paper and I've had PhDs arguing with us. And yeah, I really love time series because of this. Like, because I was doing CCAR, I was so involved in like these debates and arguments. And when I started, right, I was a junior. I knew nothing. Like, I didn't know what was going on. I had no idea the right answer. But as it's like you're trying to figure out why are the models failing every year and why can't we build more robust models, then you start to have to like dig more and more and more. And it's a fun rabbit hole to go down if you have enough time.
sure, sure, Dimitri. So I would ask any guys, any other questions, like all the students, like if you have any question, please feel free to shoot to Dimitri.
Or job questions. They can be related to jobs in CCAR.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you were talking about the white noise and then the ACF plots and the PACF plots. So can you maybe talk more about my question really was, okay, so if I do have stationary data, the snapshot of the stationary data, does it always look like that? Is it like okay, if I have stationary data, the ACF, PACF, and the IACF, which I'm not sure what it is, I have no clue what it is, and the residuals, would it always look something similar to that?
Yes.
And
Yeah. They should always look like this
okay,
because essentially what you're saying is you have something you're modeling, right? So you have like your Y variable, and that's equal to, and then you have to add in AR, MAs, exogenous variables, these macroeconomic variables. And essentially what the residuals are telling you, which is what these charts are, is they're saying that the residuals themselves are actually serially correlated. So like today's residual is related to yesterday's or a few days ago. And that's what these bars are going to show is that they're going to be peeking out of the blue area. The blue area just means statistically significant, right? Like mathematically, you'll never get it down to perfectly zero because there's always some noise. But you're going to be off somewhere. And essentially what that's telling you is there's something left on the right-hand side of that equation that we just can't explain. And worse is that there's some sort of actual trend, right? There's that relationship that's progressing over time. And so essentially the residuals are just telling you you're missing something. So as you fit the model, like they can bounce around differently within the blue, but as long as you're within these blue ranges, which is the 0.05 p-value significance of these tests, that will actually show you that like you've done a good enough job. You've extracted as much information as possible without kind of going overboard.
And my follow-up was, I think you briefly mentioned, I don't know if they're connected, but I think you briefly mentioned, so if I make sure these things happen in my ADF test, I can always be sure that my residuals are white noise. So can you maybe
Yeah, so there might be an outlier case, but almost always if your dependent and all your independent variables are going to be stationary. And also when you do the regression, the coefficients on all of the AR MAs and the exogenous variables are all statistically significant. You will almost always, I'm sure there's a rare case, but you will almost always get white noise at the end. And the reason is because the white noise test is testing for two things. It's testing for stationary, the residuals, which is basically like, is there drift going on somewhere? And then it's also testing for serial correlation. So it's kind of looking at like a minute pattern. So if you look at like this white noise chart I have, it's from lag 0 through 25. It's looking at, the residuals that we have as of today, and what is that correlation with lag 1, lag 2, lag 3, all the way through the entire series of 24 months on this 25. And you want to look at least a year to 2 years on these sorts of tests because we're modeling with seasonal cycles. But you're kind of like saying, hey, the residuals have no pattern left. There's nothing left for you to model on it. So you'll typically get these and it'll kind of look like this as you model them.
But then Dimitri, you also mentioned that if we use growth, then we might have a modeling error, right? You did mention like it is not recommended to use growth for. But let's say when we are doing differencing, isn't that the growth?
So that is a growth, but just don't use a growth of a growth, a rate of a rate.
Oh, okay. You mean the second order?
Dual rate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So like your other model, and you mentioned like, oh, you used a growth, right? Because it's a good difference. That's standard. But imagine like I've seen like, for example, you'll take like an interest rate, or you'll take a growth rate of a rate. And it's really hard to describe. I've also seen people they'll get creative with like they'll say, what is the growth rate of GDP month over month? And then they'll take the growth rate of that rate. Like they're getting really desperate here. They're trying to come up with like something that's correlated at some stance. And it's really hard to wrap your head around it. Because I mean, you can justify, right? If GDP's growth rate is like increasing, the market's going to be accelerating. We should end up in a really good spot. And if it starts to decline and the growth rate of itself is declining, forecasting wise, you should end up significantly worse. But then you say like, okay, the rate of the rates, the second derivative of this, right, is getting even faster. It's like, but it doesn't have much meaning. It's really hard to economically describe that. And then to link that back to the dependent variable and arguing like why assets are going to have like this double growth rate derivative and why this makes any sense.
Right. No, understood. Like, so yeah, I mean, second order differencing is like really tough to explain. So yeah.
Yeah. And even when you do your out of time test, almost always it'll fail.
Yeah.
See, it's always like we've had beautiful, like a model's built and someone I'm like, wow, that looks amazing. And then all of a sudden, like the out of time, like just spikes through the roof. And it's like 10 times what they've ever seen historically. And it's like, okay, the model's a little too sensitive to that rate of a rate.
No, definitely. So yeah, any other question to like all the students if you want to ask any other questions?
I can ask one more question. So I think you briefly mentioned Max is like the best one out there for modeling these things. And then you also said, I think in one of your initial slides that the banks or some institutes do fear that. So can you tell us maybe why, if you
Yeah.
can?
Yeah, I can explain why. So the banks that are not using a Max approach will just dumbly use OLS. I've seen actually an entire as a validator, and I failed a model for this. It was the weirdest thing. I could never create the scenario if I tried again. But they had essentially like imagine like a wave function, right? And you have this wave. They were not modeling the wave. They literally had a straight line going through the wave. And so the errors themselves looked normal. And so the argument was it was a valid model and it was really good and it's going to work in practice. The problem though is the residuals have serial correlation because you can see like, every 12 months, the residual is almost the exact same. So it's like they're not even capturing the relationship within itself. And then when you added these stress test scenarios, right, the Fed doesn't give you a scenario that looks this like has like a consistent process. So when you add the stressed hump in there, all of a sudden the models failed. And so we knew that when it was going to go to the regulators, it was going to fail. The reason though that some of these firms, I even interviewed at one of them, and they lectured me for like probably 40 minutes on this, on why ARIMA was horrible. ARIMA is a short-term forecast model. So the debate is going to be, is 9 quarters short term? I would argue yes, it is a short-term window because we're using monthly or quarterly. So the most you're going to ever predict is 27 data points, which really isn't that long. Or you're going to produce 9 data points, which is super, super short, I think, for most people to predict. But ARIMA, they argue, is unstable. And the reason ARIMA is unstable is because a lot of the firms can't get the stationarity. So as we were going through kind of these charts, and I'm explaining, for example, like the augmented Dickey-Fuller, you'd be shocked. A lot of the industry is doing this wrong, and they still haven't figured it out. And I still get people that will like violently argue, like it gets very heated in these meetings. And I'm printing off the paper by Dickey and Fuller. I'm like, this is like the actual paper from the guy that invented the test. Like you're not even using the test correctly. And they just don't do it correctly. And I think there's so many nuanced details in this. I mean, I've got like the original Box Jenkins textbook, like on how to actually build the ARIMA models, which is the Box Jenkins approach. But yeah, so these tests are challenging to do correctly. There's a lot of nuanced details. And then more specifically, when you start to get into like cross correlations and knowing how to test for that, which Mehul, it's great to see you guys are actually testing those cross correlations when you're doing the fitting. And then reading these sorts of tests and figuring out how the pieces get put together. The main reason the banks don't like it is it's overly complicated and they have to redevelop every year. So they view it as like it's just not working kind of thing. Where OLS, I think, is good in the sense of like you can dumbly say where we're going to go, right? Like that example of the line, like we're not modeling the wave at all. We're not getting any good accuracy, but you generally know where we're going to end up because the line has a slope and it goes one direction. But a lot of the banks, especially the smaller banks, really struggle with this because it's really, really hard to find someone who understands all these details. And even like I mentioned, like when I started, I had no idea, right? I had a master's of applied economics and I took time series. And they didn't teach us this in this grade of depth and have all these sorts of arguments here. So it's understandable. Some of the banks too disappointed me. They said this was a non-quant position and they were using like general Excel sheets with moving averages and AR terms in it. I don't know if this has changed. I sure hope it has. But yeah, there's a lot of fear from ARIMA just because it seems like it doesn't work. But often I think it doesn't work because it's just misspecified.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So, any other questions if you want to ask Dimitri? So thank you so much, Dimitri. I guess this was a wonderful session, and I mean, I did learn a lot from you, and I'm very sure all the other students have learned. So thank you so much for joining in today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to come on.
Yeah, thank you. Let me stop the recording. Yeah.